Disclaimer: this is a fictional dramatization created for artistic, emotional, and educational storytelling purposes. All characters and events are entirely fictional and created using AI tools. No impersonation, misrepresentation, or harm is intended. The content contains scenes of danger involving child characters. However, no real persons or minors were involved in its production. Grace's Love Stories produces scripted, AI-generated stories that promote, entertain, inspire kindness, and emotional connection. We respect our viewers and strictly adhere to YouTube's policies.
The scent of pine and broken earth clung to the air, a final weary sigh before the teeth of winter bit deep. Cold gnawed at Amara's bones, a familiar ache that had been her companion for the 3 weeks she'd spent fleeing through the wilds. She clutched the thin wool of her cloak, its edges frayed like the last vestiges of her hope. Before her, the great gates of the Drosin clan's hold stood like skeletal jaws, carved from ancient iron-hard wood. This was the end of the road, sanctuary or death. There was nothing in between. Her silence, the void where a voice should be, was a heavy stone in her throat. It was the reason she was here, the brand of the Omega that had seen her cast out, a broken thing deemed unworthy of a pack. Here, in the shadow of the Blackwood Mountains, the silence of the landscape felt different. It wasn't empty, it was watchful. The wind whispered through the towering pines, carrying the low growls of the guards who now circled her, their shoulders broad, their eyes the color of amber chips in the fading light. They smelled of power, of belonging. She smelled of fear. This was the last place a lone, mute Omega should seek refuge. The Western clans were ruled by an alpha whose own silence was legendary. A silence born not of defect, but of a grief so profound it had frozen his heart and throttled his wolf. Alpha Kalen Drosin, the silent wolf. They said he hadn't laughed, hadn't truly spoken beyond curt orders, since his fated mate was slain in the border wars a decade ago. He was a monument to loss, a king ruling over a court of ghosts. What mercy could a man like that have for a creature as flawed as she? But the stories also said he was just, and it was that sliver of a rumor on which she had gambled her life. The larger of the two guards, a man with a thick, graying beard and a scar that split his eyebrow, finally spoke. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together. "State your name and purpose." Amara met his gaze, forcing her chin up. She couldn't speak, but she would not cower. She let go of her cloak with one trembling hand and raised it to her chest, tapping twice, the common sign for, "I mean no harm." Then she pointed to her throat and shook her head slowly, her eyes conveying the apology she could not voice. "I cannot speak." The second guard, younger and leaner, sneered. "A mute? What use is a broken Omega to the Drosin clan? We have no need for charity cases." Shame, hot and sharp, pricked at her skin. Broken. The word had followed her since birth. She was a healer, her hands gifted with a knowledge of herbs and salves that could soothe fevers and knit flesh. But no one ever saw the skill. They only saw the flaw, heard the silence where a voice should be. She reached into the small satchel at her hip, her movement slow and deliberate, not wanting to spook them. She pulled out a small, worn wooden token carved with the sigil of a willow leaf, the mark of a traveling healer. She held it out on her palm, an offering, a plea. The older guard, whose name she'd later learn was Gregor, studied the token, then her face. His expression didn't soften, but a flicker of something other than contempt passed through his eyes. "A healer, is it? We have our own." "Let the Alpha decide," a new voice cut through the tension. It came from the shadows of the gatehouse, deep and resonant. A woman stepped forward, her hair braided with silver clasps, her gaze sharp and intelligent. She was the Beta, Ilara. Her scent was of cold mountain air and authority. "Bring her." The command was absolute. The guards grumbled but obeyed, flanking Amara as they led her through the gates and into the heart of the hold. The courtyard was a sprawling space of packed earth and stone, surrounded by longhouses built from dark timber. A great fire pit burned in the center, casting dancing shadows that made the world feel alive and menacing. Pack members paused in their duties to stare, their whispers following her like a cloud of biting insects. The weight of their scrutiny was a physical force, pressing down on her, trying to force her to her knees. She kept her eyes forward, her spine straight. She had nothing left to lose but the dignity she carried in her bones. They led her toward the largest longhouse, the Alpha's hall. Its doors were immense, carved with the snarling visage of a wolf, its fangs bared to the world. As they approached, the whispers died. A hush fell over the entire courtyard, so sudden and complete that the crackle of the fire seemed to roar in the silence. The air grew heavy, charged with an oppressive power that made the fine hairs on Amara's arms stand on end. He was here. The great doors swung inward without a sound, and there he stood, framed in the firelit darkness of his hall. Alpha Kalen Drosen was not a man. He was a force of nature carved into human form. Taller and broader than any wolf she had ever seen, his presence consumed the space around him. His hair was the color of a raven's wing, falling loose around a face that was all harsh angles and brutal beauty. A thick, puckered scar ran from his left temple down across his jaw, a white line against his weathered skin. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of a winter sky just before a storm, gray and cold and utterly devoid of light. They held a stillness that was more terrifying than any rage. This was a man who had died inside long ago and had simply forgotten to let his body fall. His wolf, the other half of his soul, was a chilling void. She could feel the absence of it, a hollow space where a roaring furnace should have been. It was like looking at a mountain that had its peak sheared off, a grand and tragic ruin. Alara the Beta spoke respectfully into the thick silence. Alpha, this Omega crossed into our lands seeking sanctuary. She is a healer. She is mute. Kalen's gaze swept over Amara, clinical and detached. There was no pity, no curiosity, not even disdain. It was the look of a man assessing a tool to see if it had any worth. The coldness of it was a physical blow, and Amara had to fight the urge to wrap her arms around herself. He took a slow step forward, and the pack members behind her seemed to shrink away, giving him a wide berth. He stopped a few feet from her, his sheer size eclipsing the firelight. The scent that rolled off him was of snow-dusted pine, cold iron, and something else. Something achingly lonely, like the smell of old ashes on a hearth long gone cold. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The air vibrated with his authority. He simply looked at her, waiting. The silence stretched, a test of her nerve. She knew what he was doing. He was waiting for her to break, to beg, to prove the weakness they all saw in her. But she had been broken so many times that the pieces had fused back together into something harder. She met his deadened gaze and held it. Finally, with a subtle flick of his fingers, he motioned toward her satchel. "Show me." Her hands shook slightly as she knelt, carefully placing her bag on the ground. She opened it and laid out its meager contents on the packed earth. Bundles of dried herbs tied with twine, small clay pots of salves and balms, clean linen bandages, and a set of polished river stones used for drawing out fever. Her life's work, her only worth, displayed on the dirt for his judgment. He crouched down, moving with a predator's silent grace that belied his size. His shadow fell over her, and she had to clench her jaw to keep from flinching. He picked up a pot of salve, rubbing a small amount between his thumb and forefinger. His hands were huge and calloused, the knuckles scarred. He brought his fingers to his nose, inhaling the scent of comfrey and yarrow. For a fleeting second, something shifted in the depths of his storm-gray eyes, a flicker of a memory, perhaps, so brief it was like the ghost of a lightning strike. Then it was gone, leaving only the endless, empty winter. He set the pot down and stood, turning his gaze back to Alara. Still, he did not speak. He gave a short, sharp nod. It was a dismissal, an acceptance. She did not know which. Alara's voice was crisp. "You may stay. You will be given rations and a place in the Omegas' quarters. You will work for your keep. Tend to the sick and injured. Do not cause trouble." Relief washed over Amara so intensely it made her dizzy. She dipped her head in a gesture of profound gratitude, her hands moving quickly to gather her precious herbs. As she reached for the last bundle, her fingers brushed against something hard and rough. Kalen's boot. He hadn't moved. She froze, her head still bowed, waiting. Was there another test? Slowly she looked up. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, but his gaze had dropped to her hand. A thin line of blood, bright red against her dirt-stained skin, trickled from a cut on her palm. She must have gotten it when she'd stumbled on the path just before reaching the gates. In her fear and exhaustion, she hadn't even felt it. Before she could think, before she could process the sheer folly of the act, her instincts took over. He was injured too. A small, fresh gash marred the back of his hand, just below the knuckles, likely from a training spar. It was shallow, insignificant to a man like him, but her healer's soul saw only a wound that needed closing. Hesitantly, she reached out. The crowd gasped. The guards tensed, their hands moving toward their blades. Touching the Alpha without invitation was a transgression punishable by death. But Amara's world had narrowed to the two of them, to the wound on her hand and the wound on his. Her movements were gentle, respectful. She wasn't challenging him. She was offering a silent word of thanks, the only way she knew how. Her fingers, stained with her own blood and the dust of her journey, lightly grazed the back of his scarred hand. The world shattered. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling. A tremor that began in the earth beneath her knees, shot up her spine, and exploded behind her eyes in a flash of white-hot light. The air crackled, suddenly thick with the scent of ozone after a lightning strike. The smell of pine and cold ash that clung to him ignited, transforming into the scent of a raging forest fire, of ancient earth and raw, untamable power. For Kalen, the impact was cataclysmic. For 10 years, his wolf had been a dormant thing, a hollowed-out cavern in his soul where a king had once resided. He had felt its death echo every day, a constant, dull ache of absence. He had accepted the silence. He had welcomed it. But at her touch, the cavern collapsed. A tremor ran through him, a deep, seismic shudder that cracked the foundations of his grief. And from the deepest, most desolate part of his being, a soundless roar erupted. It was a howl of pure, unadulterated shock, of fury, of impossible, agonizing recognition. It ripped through the silence he had so carefully constructed, a psychic scream that echoed only in the confines of his own skull. Mine. The word wasn't a thought. It was an instinct, an absolute, undeniable truth slammed into his soul with the force of a battering ram. His wolf, the beast he thought long dead and buried alongside his heart, rose from its grave. It clawed its way up from the abyss, screaming her name in a language that had no words, a symphony of scent and soul and savage primal need. Amara snatched her hand back as if burned, her eyes wide with terror and confusion. She saw the shock on his face, the way his jaw had locked, the muscles in his neck cording, but it was his eyes that stole the air from her lungs. The dead winter-gray emptiness was gone. In its place, a swirling tempest of silver fire blazed to life, ancient and possessive and utterly terrifying. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared at her, the silent howl of his reawakened wolf still shaking the very marrow of his bones. The entire pack stood frozen, watching their alpha, who for the first time in a decade looked like something other than a walking ghost. He looked like a wolf who had just found the other half of its soul, and he looked like he was about to tear the world apart to claim it. The world, which had contracted to the space between two pairs of eyes, rushed back in a cacophony of sound and shock. A collective gasp rippled through the pack. Kalen tore his gaze from Amara's as if pulling a blade from a wound, a low guttural growl ripping from his chest. It was the first sound of true, untamed emotion anyone had heard from him in a decade, and it was terrifying. It wasn't a sound of possession, it was a sound of denial, of rage. He took a stumbling step back, his big body coiling with a violence that promised to shatter bone, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, the veins standing out like cords on his forearms. The silver fire in his eyes was banked, smothered by a wave of icy control that was somehow more frightening than the inferno it replaced. The mask of the silent wolf slammed back into place, but the cracks were visible, showing the raging tempest beneath. "Alara," he bit out, his voice a low rasp, like stone grinding against stone. He didn't look at Amara again. He couldn't. To look at her was to acknowledge the howling thing in his chest that was screaming her name. "Get her out of my sight." The command was a whip crack. Alara moved instantly, her face a mask of professional calm, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of disbelief. She took Amara's arm, her grip firm but not unkind, and pulled her to her feet. "Come," she said, her voice low and urgent. The crowd of wolves parted before them, a sea of bewildered and speculative faces. The whispers started again, frantic and sharp, like the skittering of dry leaves in a harsh wind. Amara allowed herself to be led, her legs feeling like water. Her mind was a maelstrom of confusion and primal fear. She could still feel the phantom heat of his touch on her skin, a brand she hadn't asked for. More than that, she could feel a strange ethereal hum deep within her, a resonance that hadn't been there moments before. It was like a string had been tied to her soul, and the other end was firmly in the grasp of the furious, broken alpha, who refused to even look at her. She risked a glance over her shoulder. Kalen hadn't moved. He stood like a statue carved from granite and grief, staring at the spot on the ground where she had knelt, as if he could still see the ghost of their connection shimmering in the air. Alara guided her away from the main courtyard, toward a row of smaller, simpler longhouses set back near the palisade wall. These were the Omega quarters. The air here was less charged, but the weight of watching eyes followed them all the way. Alara pushed open a heavy wooden door, revealing a small, stark room. It held a narrow cot with a wool blanket, a small wooden chest, and a wash basin. A single high window let in a sliver of the bruised twilight sky. It was cold and smelled faintly of soap and loneliness. "This will be yours, Tal," Alara stated, her tone leaving no room for argument. She finally let go of Amara's arm and turned to face her, her sharp eyes scanning Amara's face, searching for answers. What was that? What happened out there? Amara could only shake her head, her own terror and confusion welling up in her throat. She pressed her lips together, the familiar frustration of her silence burning like acid. How could she explain a feeling that had no words, a cataclysm that had occurred in a single, silent touch? She raised a trembling hand to her chest, trying to convey the shock, the surge of power that wasn't hers. Alara watched her, her brow furrowed. "The Alpha? He has not shown such emotion since Lyra." She said the name softly, like a prayer or a curse. The ghost's name. His fated mate. She was killed 10 years ago. He swore an oath on her grave that he would never bond again. His wolf went silent that day. We all thought it had died with her. She paused, her gaze intensifying. Until tonight. The pieces clicked into place in Amara's mind, forming a picture of horrifying clarity. A fated bond. The rarest, most sacred connection a wolf could have. And she, a broken, mute Omega, had just stumbled into one with an Alpha who was bound by an unbreakable oath to a dead woman. She wasn't a potential mate. She was a desecration, a living, breathing insult to his eternal grief. His rage suddenly made perfect, terrible sense. Alara seemed to read the understanding on her face. A hint of something that might have been pity softened her expression. "Get some rest. In the morning, you will report to the infirmary. Old Maeve runs it. You will answer to her. Earn your keep. And," she added, her voice dropping to a low warning, "stay away from the Alpha, for your own sake." With that, she turned and left. The heavy door closing with a solid thud that echoed the closing of a cell door. Alone in the cold, silent room, Amara sank onto the cot, her body trembling uncontrollably. She wrapped her arms around herself, but the chill was deep in her bones. The silver thread of the bond pulsed within her, a faint but persistent reminder of the disaster she had wrought. It was a cruel mockery from the fates, to grant a silent woman a soul-deep connection that demanded to be spoken, to be acknowledged, and to tie her to a man whose heart was a tomb. Kalen stormed into his private chambers, slamming the heavy oak door behind him so hard the iron hinges groaned in protest. The room was vast and dark, dominated by a massive stone hearth where the embers of a fire glowed like malevolent eyes. The air was thick with the scent of old leather, wood smoke, and the faint, ghostly perfume of dried wildflowers, Lyra's scent. He had kept her things, preserved the space as a shrine to her memory. It had been his sanctuary, the one place his grief could breathe. Now it felt like a cage. His wolf, his resurrected, furious wolf, was pacing the confines of his soul, roaring with a need so primal it shook him to his core. It clawed at the walls of his control, demanding he go back, find her, claim her. The beast didn't understand oaths or memories. It only understood the fundamental truth that had slammed into him when her skin touched his. Mate. No, Kalen growled to the empty room, the word torn from him. He stalked across the furs scattered on the floor and stood before the hearth. Above it, hanging in the place of honor, was a portrait of Lyra. She was beautiful, her hair the color of spun gold, her smile radiant, her eyes the warm blue of a summer sky. She was life. She was everything he had lost. He reached up, his fingers tracing the edge of the wooden frame. For 10 years, looking at this portrait had brought a familiar, crushing weight. A pain that was his penance, his comfort, his only remaining connection to her. Tonight, for the first time, looking at her face brought a surge of something else alongside the grief, guilt. A searing, traitorous guilt that felt like he was driving a knife into his own heart. He had sworn it. On the cold earth of her grave, under the light of a shattered moon, he had sworn his heart would be hers, and hers alone, for all of eternity. He had promised her silence. He had promised her loyalty. He had promised her an emptiness that no other could ever fill, and he had meant it. His wolf's subsequent silence had been proof of his devotion, but now there was a new scent in his mind, overlaying the memory of Lyra's wildflowers. It was the scent of the Omega. Rain on dry stone, crushed wild mint, a clean earthy scent that promised resilience and quiet strength. It was a scent that his wolf was inhaling with every ragged breath, a scent that promised a new beginning. I will not, he snarled, slamming his fist against the stone mantle. Pain shot up his arm, a welcome, grounding agony. I will not betray you, Lyra. But the bond was a living thing. It was a current flowing between him and the mute woman, an undeniable reality that defied his will. He could feel her, even now. A faint awareness of her presence on the edge of his territory, a small, frightened flicker of life in the Omega quarters. It was maddening. It was a violation. He turned away from the portrait, unable to bear the imagined accusation in Lyra's painted eyes. He strode to a heavy wooden chest and threw it open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was Lyra's hunting knife, its silver handle inlaid with moonstones. He picked it up, the cold weight of it familiar in his palm. This was real. His loss was real. His oath was real. The Omega, she was an anomaly, a mistake of the fates, a test of his resolve. He would pass it. He would ignore her. He would starve the bond until it withered and died, just as his wolf should have. He would remain the silent wolf, the guardian of a dead love. He would freeze his heart over again, thicker and colder than before, until not even the fire of a fated bond could melt it. He would endure. But as he stood there, clutching the knife that belonged to his dead mate, the resurrected beast inside him threw back its head and howled her name in silent, agonizing protest. Amara. The morning came with sunlight as thin and pale as watered milk, doing little to chase away the chill that had seeped into Amara's bones. Sleep had been a fitful, shallow thing, haunted by the feeling of blazing silver eyes and the phantom pulse of a connection she didn't want and couldn't sever. It was still there, a low, constant hum beneath the surface of her thoughts, a faint thrumming in her blood that was inextricably tied to him. The Alpha, Kalen. Even thinking his name felt like a transgression. She dressed in the simple clothes left for her, a tunic of undyed wool and dark leggings, and braided her dark hair tightly, a small act of imposing order on a world that had spiraled into chaos. She had a purpose here. She was a healer. She would cling to that identity like a drowning woman to a piece of driftwood. It was the only thing that was truly hers. Following Alara's instructions, she found the infirmary. It was a long, low building set apart from the main hall, a plume of herbal-scented smoke curling from a stone chimney. Pushing open the heavy door, she stepped into a world of controlled quiet. The air was thick with the competing scents of dried lavender, sharp antiseptic willow bark, and the faint metallic tang of old blood. Rows of cots lined one wall, most empty, but one held a sleeping elder, his breathing a shallow rasp. Bunches of herbs hung from the rafters, casting long, dancing shadows, and shelves were crammed with clay pots, glass vials, and neatly folded bandages. A woman with a back as straight as a spear shaft, and hair the color of frosted iron, stood at a heavy wooden table, grinding herbs with a stone pestle. She didn't look up as Amara entered. "We've no need for another mouth to feed," the woman said, her voice dry and brittle as an autumn leaf. "Whatever show you put on for the Alpha, it won't work on me. I am Maeve. I've been the healer for this clan for 50 years. I've seen everything. I am not impressed by strays. Amara felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but she didn't retreat. She approached the table silently and waited. She recognized the herbs Maeve was grinding, feverfew and river root, a potent combination for breaking stubborn infections. She also saw that the grind was too coarse. It would make a gritty poultice that would irritate the skin. Maeve finally glanced up, her pale blue eyes sharp and assessing. She took in Amara's plain clothes, her steady gaze, her silence. Well, what are you waiting for? Words of welcome? You'll get none from me. The stores need sorting. The linens need boiling. Get to it. She gestured with her chin toward a pile of soiled bandages in a corner. Amara gave a short nod of acquiescence. For the next several hours, she worked without complaint. She hauled buckets of steaming water, scrubbed linens until her knuckles were raw, and sorted dried herbs into their proper bundles with a meticulousness that spoke of long practice. She moved with a quiet efficiency that slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to alter the atmosphere in the room. Maeve said nothing, but Amara felt the woman's sharp gaze on her, watching, judging. Later, a young mother brought in a small boy, his face flushed with fever, his body trembling with chills. Maeve examined him, her touch surprisingly gentle, and prepared a bitter tea. But the boy, delirious and frightened, refused to drink, crying and pushing the cup away. Maeve's patience wore thin. He must drink it, child, or the fever will climb. Seeing the distress of both mother and child, Amara acted. She moved to the hearth and warmed a small, smooth river stone from her own satchel. Returning to the cot, she gently took the boy's small, hot hand in hers. She didn't try to force the medicine. Instead, she began to rub the warmed stone in slow, soothing circles on his palm, her touch feather-light. She met the boy's frightened eyes with a look of calm reassurance. As she continued the rhythmic motion, his panicked cries slowly subsided into whimpers, his small body uncoiling from its tense knot. He was still feverish, but the terror had eased. Amara then dipped a clean cloth in cool water and gently wiped his forehead. Only then did she nod toward the tea. The mother offered it again, and this time, the boy drank. When the mother had left, her child finally sleeping peacefully, Maeve stood by the table, watching Amara clean the cup. The old healer was silent for a long time. There is more to healing than herbs and stitches, Maeve said finally, her voice softer than before. You have a gentle hand. Perhaps you are not entirely useless. It was the closest thing to a compliment Amara had received in years. A fragile sense of peace began to settle in her chest, but it was shattered by a sudden, violent thrum from the bond. It was so strong it made her gasp, her hand flying to her chest as if she'd been struck. It was a wave of pure, unadulterated rage, mixed with the sharp agony of exertion. It was him, Kalen. Outside, the sounds of the training yard, the rhythmic clash of steel, the grunts of exertion, had grown more frantic, more brutal. Through the infirmary window, she could see him. He moved like a dark storm at the center of the training circle, his sparring blade a blur of silver. He was bare to the waist despite the biting cold, his scarred torso slick with sweat. He wasn't training his warriors, he was punishing them. He was punishing himself. He fought with a desperate, self-destructive fury, trying to exhaust the howling beast inside him, trying to beat back the ghost of her touch. The entire pack was on edge, the air thick with their unease. Every warrior who faced him ended up on their back in the dirt, gasping for air. Amara could feel the echo of his every blow, the jarring impact shuddering through her own bones via the invisible thread that connected them. It made her nauseous. She turned away from the window, her hands trembling, trying to focus on her work. But the violent pulse of his emotions was an unrelenting assault on her senses. Then came a sharp crack, followed by a roar of pain that was not the alpha's. Maeve cursed under her breath and grabbed a satchel. Fools, he'll break them all before the snows set in for good. A moment later, 2 warriors burst into the infirmary, supporting a third between them. The injured man's leg was bent at a sickening angle. As Maeve rushed to help, Amara saw him. Kalen stood in the doorway, his chest heaving, his face a mask of thunderous fury. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, swept the room and landed on her. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. The frantic thrumming of the bond intensified, becoming a deafening roar in her soul. It was a torrent of his feelings, rage, pain, frustration, and underneath it all, a deep, possessive pull that terrified and mesmerized her in equal measure. He took a half step inside, his gaze locking with hers, and she felt as if he were trying to flay her soul open with that look alone. Then, with a visible, shuddering effort, he ripped his eyes away, turning his attention to the injured man. His control was back, the mask of ice firmly in place, but she had seen it. The inferno was still burning. Another warrior rushed in, his face pale. "Alpha, your arm." Kalen glanced down, almost dismissively. A long, wicked-looking gash ran along his forearm, a clean cut from a sparring blade that had slipped. Dark blood welled up, dripping onto the stone floor in a steady rhythm. It was a deep wound, far worse than the one he'd had the day before. "It is nothing," he growled, his voice a low vibration that seemed to shake the very walls. "It is not nothing, you stubborn fool," Maeve snapped, her authority as a healer momentarily overriding his as alpha. "It will need stitching. Sit." He looked as if he might refuse, might simply turn and walk away to let it bleed. But then his gaze flickered, against his will, back to Amara. To defy Maeve in front of her would be something, an admission, a weakness. With a barely suppressed snarl, he stalked over to a stool and sat, holding out his arm. Maeve was busy setting the other man's leg, her full attention required. She glanced at Amara. "You, clean it, pack it with blood moss. I will stitch it when I'm done." Amara's heart hammered against her ribs. To touch him again, after what had happened? It was madness, but to refuse was not an option. This was her duty. She was a healer. She took a deep, steadying breath, gathering her supplies, a bowl of clean water, linen cloths, and a pot of moss. Her movements were slow, deliberate, her healer's calm descending like a shroud, smothering her fear. She knelt before him. He was so large he seemed to block out the light. The scent of him filled her senses, sweat, blood, cold mountain air, and the furious, caged storm of his wolf. He did not look at her. He stared at the far wall, his jaw set so tightly, a muscle jumped along the scar line. She reached out, her fingers trembling almost imperceptibly. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then laid her hand gently on his bicep to steady his arm. The world exploded in silent, white-hot fire. If their first touch had been a spark, this was a lightning strike. The bond, already agitated, flared into a raging inferno. A wave of pure, raw sensation crashed over Amara, so intense it made her vision swim. She felt his shock, his pain, and a sudden, staggering wave of possessiveness that was so powerful it was almost a physical blow. It wasn't just his wolf, it was him, mine. The word echoed in the deepest part of her soul, a silent claim that buckled her knees. Kalen let out a harsh, strangled gasp, his whole body going rigid. His head snapped down, his stormy eyes, now blazing with silver fire, locking onto hers. The mask was gone. The control was shattered. All that was left was the raw, primal truth of the bond, laid bare and undeniable between them. Amara forced herself to breathe, to focus. Her training took over, a lifeline in the tempest. She began to clean the wound, her touch gentle but firm. Her fingers moved with practiced grace, wiping away the blood, assessing the damage. He didn't flinch, he didn't move. He just watched her, his breathing harsh and uneven. His gaze was an intense, physical weight, tracing the line of her jaw, the curve of her neck, her bent head. He was watching her as if he'd been starving, and she was the first sustenance he'd seen in a lifetime. She packed the wound with the soft, absorbent blood moss, her fingers brushing against his skin. Each point of contact sent a fresh jolt of energy arcing between them. It was agony, it was ecstasy. It was a language of scars, his and hers, speaking to each other in a way that defied silence. She finished her work and began to pull back. His other hand shot out, clamping around her wrist. His grip wasn't brutal, but it was like iron, an unbreakable manacle of warm flesh. She froze, her eyes flying to his. The silver fire in his gaze was mesmerizing. The rage was still there, but it was tangled with something else. Something confused and desperate, and achingly raw. He opened his mouth as if to speak, to roar, to deny what was happening. But what came out was a ragged, broken sound, like rock cracking under immense pressure. It was the ghost of a word, a name torn from the depths of his soul, against his will. The sound hung in the charged air between them, the first syllable of her name, the first crack in a decade of silence, a promise and a curse all in one. The syllable of her name, a broken shard of sound, hung in the air between them like a ghost. For a breathless moment, Kaylin's silver fire eyes held hers, a universe of conflict raging in their depths. Then, as if her gaze were a physical brand, he recoiled. He ripped his hand from her wrist, snatching it back as if he'd touched pure flame. The absence of his touch was a shock of cold, leaving her skin tingling and strangely empty. He surged to his feet, a dark mountain of muscle and fury. A guttural snarl tore from his throat, a sound of pure self-loathing. He didn't look at her again. He couldn't. He turned and stormed from the infirmary, his broad shoulders filling the doorway for a second before he was gone, leaving behind a vibrating silence and the faint scent of his rage. Amara was left kneeling on the cold stone floor, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Her wrist, where his fingers had been clamped, felt both bruised and blessed. The warriors who had brought in their injured comrade stared at her, their expressions a mixture of awe and fear. They had just witnessed their frozen alpha crack. They had seen the living legend bleed emotion, and they seemed to believe she was some kind of witch who had caused it. Enough gawking, Maeve's sharp voice cut through the tension. The old healer had finished setting the broken leg, and now turned her shrewd gaze on Amara. She missed nothing. She had seen the raw energy arc between them, had heard the ghost of a word Kaylin had spoken. The wound is packed. Finish bandaging it. The simple command was an anchor. Amara nodded, her hands still trembling as she picked up a roll of clean linen. She focused on the task, on the neat, precise wrapping of the bandage around the alpha's wound, which now resided on another man's arm. But it was Kaylin she felt. The bond was a live wire, transmitting the violent, chaotic storm of his emotions as he fled. She felt his flight through the hold, his desperate need for space, for air, for an escape from himself. From her. The rest of the day passed in a blur of work. Amara pounded roots into paste, stitched a deep cut on a woodcutter's hand, and brewed teas for the elder with the lingering cough. She kept her head down, her movements economical, her silence a shield. But she was no longer just an anonymous Omega. She was the woman who had made the silent wolf speak. Whispers followed her like her own shadow. When she went to the communal hall for the midday meal, the long tables fell quiet as she entered. Wolves, men and women with the power to tear a man limb from limb, averted their eyes as if she carried a dangerous plague. She was an anomaly, a disruption to the grim, predictable order Kaylin had maintained for a decade. She took a piece of bread and some cheese and ate outside in the cold, the feeling of isolation a familiar, painful cloak. She felt his anger all day, a low, simmering rage that pulsed from the direction of the mountains. He had gone to the Blackwood, to the cold, unforgiving wilderness that was his true territory. He was running, pushing his body to its limits, trying to outrun the bond, trying to outrun the memory of her touch. Each surge of his exertions sent a corresponding tremor through her, leaving her feeling breathless and agitated. It was impossible to ignore. He was a constant, tumultuous presence at the edge of her awareness. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the sky, Maeve approached her. The old healer held out a small woven basket. "The moon will be full tonight," Maeve said, her voice neutral. "I need moon petal. It only opens in the full light, and it's most potent when gathered before midnight. You'll find it in the glade by the standing stones, west of the hold." She paused, her pale eyes searching Amara's face. "The air will sharpen your senses. Be careful." It wasn't just a request. It was a test, or perhaps a kindness, a reason to be outside, away from the suffocating scrutiny of the pack, in the one place where the chaos inside her might find a strange harmony with the wild. Amara nodded, taking the basket. The moon rose, a perfect luminous disk of bone-white light in an indigo sky. It bathed the world in shades of silver and black, sharpening the edges of the pines and casting shadows that writhed like living things. The air grew colder, but it also grew thicker, charged with a primal energy that made Amara's skin hum. The bond to Kaylin, which had been a throbbing ache all day, now began to keen. A high, piercing note of pure longing that vibrated in her very marrow. It was his wolf, she realized, not just his. The beast inside him, fully awakened, was calling to her under the moon's ancient gaze. She followed the path Maeve had described, the silver light guiding her way. The forest was not silent. It was alive with the rustle of unseen creatures and the sigh of the wind through the high branches. She felt strangely unafraid. The pull of the bond was a compass in her soul, and though it led toward a man who despised her very existence, it also felt right, inevitable. She found the glade easily. A circle of tall, moss-covered stones stood like ancient sentinels around a clearing. In the center, bathed in direct moonlight, a patch of delicate, five-petaled flowers had opened, their petals glowing with a soft, ethereal luminescence. Moon petal. She knelt, her basket beside her, and began to gently pluck the flowers. The work was calming, the soft texture of the petals cool against her fingertips. But the keening call of the bond grew stronger, more insistent. It was a physical pull now, a desperate ache in her chest that urged her to go somewhere else. It was a feeling of deep, soul-shattering grief, of profound loneliness, and a stubborn, defiant loyalty. It was his heart, bleeding its sorrow into the night. She finished her task, the basket half full of glowing blossoms. She should go back, but her feet would not obey. The pull was irresistible, drawing her away from the standing stones, deeper into the woods. She walked as if in a trance, following the invisible thread that tied her soul to his. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to. The forest grew denser, older. The trees here were ancient behemoths, their branches forming a high canopy that the moonlight struggled to pierce. She came to a small clearing, one that felt different, sacred. The air here was heavy with the scent of old memories and sorrow. In the center of the clearing, under the gnarled branches of a massive ancient oak, was a single unmarked stone of white quartz, a grave, and kneeling before it was Kalen. He was a silhouette of pure agony against the moonlit stone. His back was to her, his head bowed, his huge shoulders slumped in a posture of utter defeat. The rage was gone, burned away, leaving only the raw, hollowed-out grief that had been his companion for 10 years. He was speaking to the grave, his voice low and thick with unshed tears, a heartbroken murmur that the wind stole and scattered. Amara froze at the edge of the clearing, hidden in the shadows of a great pine. This was a holy place, a private shrine. She was an intruder, a sacrilege. She should flee, but she was rooted to the spot, a helpless witness to his torment. She could feel his pain as if it were her own, a crushing weight of loss, a desperate clinging to a memory, a terrible, tearing guilt. The guilt was new. The guilt was because of her. "I'm sorry, Lyra," he whispered to the stone, his voice cracking. "I am trying. I swear on my soul, I am trying to honor you, but it's a fire in my blood, a poison. She looks at me and I forget how to breathe. Her silence, it's louder than any scream." He slammed a fist into the cold earth, a tremor of frustration shaking his entire body. "My wolf, it calls for her. After 10 years of silence, it betrays you. It betrays me. For her." He fell silent, his body trembling with the force of his inner war. He was renewing his vow, reaffirming his loyalty to the ghost that owned his heart. He was choosing the dead over the living. He was choosing his oath over the bond. The finality of it was a cold blade in Amara's own heart. The bond shrieked in protest, a silent scream of rejection that mirrored his own. He must have felt it. He must have felt her presence, the sudden spike of her own anguish mirroring his. Slowly, as if moving against 1,000 pounds of resistance, he turned his head. His face was a mask of torment in the stark moonlight, his features carved from shadow and silver. Tears tracked clean paths through the grime on his cheeks, but it was his eyes that captured her, that held her pinned in the darkness. They were no longer gray. They were gone. In their place were 2 pools of molten silver, glowing with the pure, undiluted power of the beast within. The alpha, the wolf, he saw her. He rose to his feet in a single fluid motion, his immense frame unfolding from the ground. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had been expecting the final killing blow of his fate. A growl started deep in his chest. It was not a sound of warning. It was a sound of primal agony, of a soul being ripped in two. It was the sound of a wolf caught in a trap, torn between the instinct to flee and the instinct to fight. It was a sound that said, "Go and stay and mine all at once." And he took a single, deliberate step toward her, his silver eyes blazing with a terrifying, magnetic promise of utter devastation. The growl was a physical thing, a vibration that traveled from his chest, across the moon-drenched clearing, and sank deep into Amara's bones. It was a sound of absolute conflict, the grinding of two tectonic plates of emotion, grief and desire, loyalty and instinct. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with the raw power of his wolf, which was now looking at her through his eyes. Pure silver, luminous and predatory, they held her captive more surely than any chains. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to run. This was not the alpha. This was the beast, raw and untamed, stripped of all human control by the power of the full moon and the shock of her presence in his most sacred space. To be here was a blasphemy. To be the cause of his torment was a sin she couldn't name. But she didn't run. Her feet were leaden, rooted to the forest floor. The bond, that terrible, beautiful thread between them, flared to life, a conduit of pure, undiluted feeling. She felt his warring emotions as if they were her own, the crushing weight of his oath to the dead, the savage, undeniable pull toward her, and the searing self-hatred that he could feel both at once. It was a maelstrom that threatened to tear him apart, and she was the anchor point of the storm. He took another slow, deliberate step toward her, the muscles in his powerful legs bunching. The silver light in his eyes intensified, hypnotic and dangerous. He was stalking her, his predator's instincts overriding all else. The human part of him, the grieving man who knelt at a grave, was submerged beneath the tide of the wolf who had found its mate. Amara's heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. She was unarmed, an omega before a dominant, tormented alpha. She was utterly at his mercy. But as he drew closer, the scent of him rolling off his skin, pine, winter air, and a grief so profound it smelled like cold stone, she saw something else in the depths of those silver eyes. It wasn't just hunger. It was a desperate, silent plea. A plea for what she didn't know. Release, forgiveness, understanding. He stopped a mere arm's length away, his sheer size eclipsing the moonlight. He loomed over her, a creature of myth and shadow. He lowered his head, his breathing a harsh, ragged sound in the stillness of the clearing. He was close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Slowly, as if compelled by a force greater than himself, he lifted a hand. It was the hand that had gripped her wrist, scarred and calloused, a weapon that could snap her neck in a heartbeat. He raised it not to strike, but with a strange, reverent slowness. His fingers, trembling with a barely suppressed violence, reached for her face. Amara flinched, a small, involuntary jerk, but she held her ground. She held his gaze, her own eyes wide with a fear that was mingled with a startling, unwelcome surge of compassion. She saw the man beneath the beast. She saw the agony. His fingers grazed her cheek, his touch as light as a moth's wing, yet it sent a jolt of white-hot lightning through her entire system. The bond ignited, a roaring bonfire in her soul. A choked sound, half growl, half groan, was torn from his throat. His silver eyes dilated, the pupils shrinking to pinpricks as his wolf drank in the sensation of her. He traced the line of her jaw, his thumb coming to rest just below her lips. He was mapping her, learning her, committing her to a memory he was simultaneously trying to erase. The intimacy of the gesture was more terrifying than any threat. It was a silent confession. His wolf was claiming her, even as the man fought it with every fiber of his being. "You should not be here," he rasped, his voice a low, gravelly whisper, the first full sentence he had directed at her. The sound of it vibrated through her, a dark, dangerous melody. She couldn't answer. She could only look at him, her heart in her eyes, trying to convey the apology she couldn't speak, the regret that she had trespassed on his sorrow. His thumb brushed against her lower lip, and a shudder racked his entire frame. He was losing. The battle was being lost. The scent of her, rain and mint, and the clean, earthy fragrance of her soul, was an intoxicating poison, overriding the ghost scent of wildflowers he had clung to for a decade. His head dipped lower, his gaze dropping to her mouth. He was going to kiss her. The knowledge was a certainty, a terrifying, exhilarating inevitability. hanging in the charged air. The alpha was going to claim her lips, and in doing so, break the most sacred vow of his life. But Amara knew, with a sudden gut-wrenching clarity, that if he did, he would shatter. The guilt would destroy what was left of him. His honor, his grief, the entire identity he had built on the foundation of his loss, would turn to ash, and she would be the one holding the torch. In that moment, she did the only thing she could. She acted not out of fear for herself, but out of a strange, fierce need to protect him from his own instinct. She broke his mesmerized gaze and looked past him at the cold white stone of Lyra's grave. Then she brought her eyes back to his, her expression filled with a sorrow that was not her own, but a reflection of his. She shook her head, a small, slow, deliberate movement. "No, don't. Not for me. Not for you." Her silent denial, her understanding of his conflict, was a more effective blow than any physical strike. It reached past the wolf and struck the man. It was a mirror held up to his actions, and what he saw reflected there horrified him. The silver light in his eyes flickered, faltered. The cold gray of the human man began to bleed back in, extinguishing the primal fire. He snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned, a harsh, ragged gasp tearing from his lungs. The mask of the silent alpha slammed back into place, but this time it was fractured, ill-fitting, unable to hide the raw agony beneath. He stared at her for a long, shuddering moment, his face a battleground of warring emotions. Then, without another word, he turned and fled. He didn't run as a man. He moved with the desperate, ground-eating lope of a wolf, crashing through the undergrowth, putting as much distance between them as he possibly could. The sound of his retreat faded, leaving Amara alone in the clearing with the grave and the silent, watchful moon. She sank to her knees, her body trembling with the aftermath of the encounter. The basket of moon petal lay forgotten beside her. She reached up and touched her cheek where his fingers had been. The skin still burned, branded by his touch. She had faced down the alpha's wolf and survived. She had offered him a silent refusal that was, in its own way, an act of mercy, but there was no triumph in it, only a profound and aching sadness. The bond between them was no longer just a pull of instinct. It was now complicated by a shared moment of impossible intimacy and a shared terrible pain. She stayed there for a long time, the cold of the earth seeping into her clothes. Finally, she gathered her basket and made her way back to the hold. The path felt different now, the shadows deeper, the silence heavier. When she returned to the infirmary, Maeve was waiting, a single candle burning on the table. The old healer's eyes scanned Amara's face, taking in her pallor, the slight tremor in her hands, the scent of the deep woods and distressed alpha that clung to her like a shroud. Maeve took the basket of glowing flowers without a word. She busied herself for a moment, laying them out to dry on a linen cloth. "There are wounds that herbs cannot touch," Maeve said softly, not looking at Amara. "Wounds in the marrow. He has been carrying his for 10 years. It has become a part of his bones." She finally turned, her pale eyes piercing. "He chose it. He chose the ghost. Every day he makes that choice. But the fates are cruel, and they have sent you to ask him the question again." Amara looked down at her hands, feeling the weight of the old healer's words. She was a question the alpha could not answer. "He will hate you for it," Maeve continued, her voice devoid of malice, stating it as a simple, undeniable fact. "He will hate you because his wolf does not. And a man at war with his own soul is the most dangerous beast in any forest." Maeve picked up a small empty vial and handed it to Amara. "For you, a sleeping draught, you will need it. The whispers in the marrow are loudest in the dark." Amara took the vial, her fingers closing around the cool glass. She knew Maeve was right. She wouldn't sleep tonight, not when the echo of his touch was a fire on her skin, and the feeling of his broken heart was a permanent ache in her own. The days that followed were a study in avoidance. Kaelin became a ghost of a different sort, a phantom of authority who was felt but never seen. He took his meals in his chambers, issued his orders through Alara, and drove his warriors in the training yard with a relentless, punishing intensity that left them battered and exhausted. He never entered the infirmary. He never crossed Amara's path. If their gazes happened to meet across the courtyard, his was a wall of glacial ice, shutting her out so completely it was a physical blow. Yet the bond was a constant, undeniable presence. It was a low, humming wire stretched taut between them. Amara felt the restless pacing of his wolf at night, the iron-willed control he exerted during the day, and the deep, unending river of grief that flowed beneath it all. She learned the rhythms of his moods as surely as she knew the rise and fall of the sun. His fury was a spike of heat in her blood. His sorrow was a cold weight in her stomach. His carefully constructed absence was a shout in the silence between them. She threw herself into her work, finding a fragile peace in the familiar rituals of healing. She earned a grudging respect from Maeve, and a quiet acceptance from the pack members who came to her for aid. They saw her skill, her gentle hands, her unwavering calm. They began to see the healer, not just the mute Omega, who had unsettled their alpha. The whispers hadn't stopped, but their tone had shifted from suspicion to a kind of wary curiosity. But peace was a fleeting thing. One evening, as the first heavy snow of the season began to fall, dusting the world in a blanket of white, a rider galloped through the gates, his horse lathered and steaming. He was from a northern patrol, his face grim, his scent laced with fear and blood. "Hunters," he gasped out to Alara in the center of the courtyard. A large band, well armed with silver. They ambushed Torvin's patrol near the old pass. Torvin is down, so are 2 others. They're pressing south. The news ripped through the hold like a blast of Arctic wind. Human hunters, emboldened and organized, were a threat they hadn't faced on the scale in years. An alarm horn blew, its mournful call echoing off the mountainside. Warriors grabbed their weapons, their faces hardening into grim masks. The air, once filled with the mundane sounds of evening, now crackled with the electric tension of imminent battle. Kalen appeared on the steps of the Great Hall. He was no longer the absent alpha. He was every inch the warlord, clad in black leather armor, Lyra's moonstone-hilted knife strapped to his thigh, his face a chiseled mask of cold fury. His gaze swept over his assembled warriors, and his voice, when he spoke, was the embodiment of command. "They dare spill our blood on our own lands," he said, his voice a low, deadly rumble that carried to every corner of the courtyard. "We will show them the price of that arrogance. We ride in 10 minutes. There was no cheer, only the grim, determined sound of warriors checking their gear. Amara, standing near the infirmary door with Maeve, felt a cold dread snake around her heart. The bond was thrumming with a violent, focused rage. It was a killing rage, the fury of an alpha whose territory and pack had been violated. Maeve was already moving, barking orders. "Amara, prepare the battle kits. Blood moss, stitch needles, feverfew for the pain, everything we have. We'll set up here. They'll bring the wounded to us." Amara worked with frantic efficiency, her hands flying as she packed satchels with medical supplies. But her eyes kept being drawn back to the courtyard, to him. He moved through his warriors, a dark angel of death, giving quiet orders, his presence a steadying force for them all. He was their king, their shield, and he was walking into a fight against men armed with silver, the one substance that could kill a wolf shifter as easily as a common man. As the war party prepared to mount, Alara approached him, her face etched with concern. "You should not lead this charge, Kalen. Your place is here, at the heart of the hold. Let me take the vanguard." "No," he said, his voice absolute. "The blood that was spilled was mine to protect. The vengeance will be mine to deliver." His eyes, hard as flint, scanned the courtyard one last time. They passed over Amara, lingered for a half-second, and in that fleeting moment, the bond screamed. It was a wave of pure, primal terror, not for himself, but for her. A fierce, protective instinct so powerful it momentarily cracked his icy facade. He was going into battle, and his last thought was of her safety. Then the moment was gone. He swung onto the back of his massive black warhorse, and without a backward glance, led his warriors out into the swirling snow and the encroaching darkness. The wait was an agony unlike any she had ever known. The hold was eerily quiet, populated only by the elders, the mothers, and the young. The snow fell faster, a thick, silent curtain that seemed to swallow all sound. Amara stood with Maeve at the infirmary door, straining her ears for the sound of returning hooves, for the clash of steel, for anything. The bond was her only connection to the battle, and it was a torment. It transmitted flashes of the fight, a chaotic symphony of sensation and emotion. She felt the searing rage as he engaged the enemy, the jarring impact of a blow, a sharp, slicing pain that wasn't hers, the metallic taste of blood, the grim satisfaction of a kill. It was a brutal, overwhelming onslaught that left her breathless and trembling. A phantom combatant in a war she could not see. Hours crawled by. The snow piled up in silent drifts. Then, a new sensation pulsed through the bond, sharp and sickening. Agony. Not the clean pain of a sword cut, but a deep, burning, corrosive pain that felt wrong. It was a pain that stole strength, that felt like poison in the veins. Silver. A cry, silent and broken, caught in her throat. She stumbled, her hand flying to her own side, where a phantom fire was blooming. He was hurt. Badly. Maeve gripped her arm, her old eyes sharp with alarm. "What is it, child? What do you feel?" Amara could only look at her, her eyes wide with terror, and clutch at her side. It felt like an eternity later when the first riders returned. They came not in triumph, but as a ragged, wounded procession. They brought the injured with them, slung over their saddles. The infirmary was instantly thrown into a maelstrom of controlled chaos. Men were groaning, their flesh burned black where silver had touched them. Maeve and Amara moved from cot to cot, cleaning wounds, administering salves, their hands quickly becoming slick with blood. Amara worked in a haze of fear, her eyes constantly scanning the doorway, waiting. Finally, they brought him in. He was half carried between two of his largest warriors, his head lolling, his face the color of ash. A deep, ragged gash ran along his left side, from his ribs down to his hip. It wasn't bleeding much. The edges of the wound were cauterized, blackened and smoking, the flesh sizzling with the foul poison of a silver blade. "Clear a table," Maeve roared. They laid him on the heavy oak table in the center of the room. He was conscious, barely. His eyes were glazed with pain, but when they found Amara, a flicker of awareness returned. The bond, which had been a scream of agony, now pulsed with a weak, desperate signal. "The silver, it's in him," Maeve said, her face grim as she examined the wound. "If we don't get it out, the poison will reach his heart. He won't heal. He'll die." She looked at Amara, her expression stark. "I need to cut deep to find the shards. I need you to hold him, keep him still. No matter what he does, you cannot let him move." Amara nodded, her throat tight with terror. She moved to the head of the table. Kaelin's eyes followed her. She could feel his fading strength, the way his wolf was retreating, trying to fight a poison it could not beat. She placed her hands on his shoulders, her touch as gentle as she could make it. His skin was fever hot. "Kaelin," she whispered in her mind, pouring all her strength, all her will, into the bond. "Stay with me. Fight." His eyes fluttered, and for a moment, he seemed to focus on her face. A shudder went through him, and his hand, slick with his own blood, moved, his fingers weakly closing around her wrist. It wasn't a grip of strength, but of desperation. An anchor in a sea of pain. Maeve took a long, thin knife, heating the blade in the fire until it glowed red. "This will be agony," she warned, more to Amara than to Kaelin. "Brace yourself." As the hot blade touched the burned flesh of his wound, Kaelin's body arched off the table with a strangled, inhuman roar of pure agony. His grip on Amara's wrist became a vice, his knuckles white. His wolf, tormented and poisoned, surged to the surface, his eyes flashing a weak, desperate silver. He thrashed, his powerful body fighting against the hands holding him down. "Hold him, girl," Maeve grunted, probing the wound. Amara leaned over him, putting her weight onto his shoulders, her face close to his. She didn't fight his strength. She tried to lend him hers. She met his pain-crazed eyes, pouring every ounce of her silent will, her fear, her desperate need for him to live, down the conduit of the bond. "I am here," she sent, the thought a raw, powerful wave. "I am here. Do not leave me." His thrashing lessened, his gaze locked with hers, a drowning man finding a single point of light in the darkness. He was still in agony, but he seemed to be focused on her, drawing on her presence. His grip on her wrist was the only thing anchoring him to consciousness. "Found one," Maeve muttered, using a pair of forceps to pull a twisted shard of silver from the wound. Kaelin roared again, his body convulsing. But his eyes never left Amara's. In their depths, she saw the war finally end. The hatred, the denial, the fight against the bond, it was all burned away by the fire of the silver poison. All that was left was a raw, desperate need. Maeve worked tirelessly, her face beaded with sweat, pulling shard after shard of the cursed metal from his flesh. With each one, Kalen's life seemed to ebb further away. His grip on her wrist weakened, his breathing grew shallow. "He's fading," Alara said from the doorway, her voice tight with fear. "I've gotten all I can," Maeve said, her voice ragged with exhaustion. "But the poison is deep in his blood. His wolf is too weak to fight it." Amara looked down at him, at the proud, powerful alpha brought low, his life slipping away before her eyes. The oath he had made on a grave, a promise to never bond, to never love again, was killing him. His body, his wolf, could not fully accept the healing power of a new bond, while his soul was still shackled to an old one. He was caught between two worlds, and the conflict was draining the life from him. She knew, with a certainty that was terrifying and absolute, what she had to do. His oath was a wall of ice around his heart. Only a fire just as strong could melt it. Leaning down, her hair falling around his face like a dark curtain, she ignored the blood, the pain, the eyes of everyone in the room. She looked into his fading gaze, and she made a silent vow of her own. Then she pressed her lips to his. It was not a kiss of passion, but of desperation. A transference of life, of will, of soul. The moment her lips touched his, the bond between them didn't just flare, it detonated. A blinding white light exploded behind her eyes, and she poured everything she was, her silence, her strength, her healing, her very life force, into him. A shockwave of pure energy erupted from them, knocking over vials on a nearby shelf. For a single breathless second, Kalen's body went rigid, his back arching off the table. A silent scream ripped through the bond, the sound of an old oath shattering, of a ghost being released, of a heart frozen for 10 years, finally, agonizingly, starting to beat again. His silver eyes blazed with a light so bright it was almost painful to behold. Then he went limp, his head falling to the side, his hand falling away from her wrist. He was completely, terrifyingly still. The silence in the infirmary was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket broken only by the frantic crackle of the fire. Amara pulled back from Kalen, her lips tingling, her body trembling with the aftershock of the energy she had poured into him. He lay utterly still on the blood-soaked table, his face a pale, waxy mask. His chest did not rise. His eyes were closed. The vibrant, chaotic hum of the bond had gone utterly, terrifyingly quiet. A collective gasp went through the room. Alara took a half-step forward, her hand flying to her mouth, her face a canvas of disbelief and horror. Maeve, her face gray with fatigue, reached out a trembling hand, pressing 2 fingers to the side of Kalen's throat, searching for a pulse. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Amara's world narrowed to the space of Maeve's touch, to the still form of the Alpha, whose life she had tried to save, and might have just extinguished. Had she killed him? Had the shock of breaking a decade-old oath, of forcing a bond on a soul still shackled to a ghost, been too much for his poisoned body to bear? The thought was a shard of ice in her heart. Maeve's shoulders slumped. She started to pull her hand away, a look of profound defeat on her face. He's... And then it came. A single, shuddering breath. Kalen's chest hitched, then rose in a deep, ragged inhalation that sounded like a man taking his first breath after drowning. His eyes flew open, but they were not the storm gray of the man, or the molten silver of the wolf. They were something new, a fusion of both, a swirling, luminous gray-silver, clear and deep and achingly alive. The bond which had fallen silent roared back to life, not as a chaotic storm, but as a clear, powerful, resonant chord that vibrated in Amara's very soul. It was a song of completion, of acceptance, of healing. A low groan escaped his lips, and he tried to sit up, his hand going to the wound in his side. "Easy, you great fool," Maeve snapped, her voice thick with relief, pushing him gently back down. "Lie still, the poison is fighting back." But the difference was immediate, miraculous. The blackened edges of the wound, which had been sizzling with Silver's curse, were already beginning to recede. Healthy pink flesh was beginning to knit together at a speed that was unnaturally fast, even for a shifter. His color was returning, the ashen pallor replaced by the flush of life. The bond was pouring healing energy into him, mending what the silver had broken, and his body was finally fully accepting it. He wasn't looking at Maeve. His gaze, clear and sharp, was locked on Amara. He stared at her as if he were seeing her for the first time, not as a complication, not as a desecration, but as she was. As his. The conflict was gone from his eyes, replaced by a raw, staggering wonder. He reached out his hand, not in desperation this time, but with a quiet, deliberate purpose. She met him halfway, her smaller hand finding his fingers wrapped around hers, a warm, solid weight that felt like coming home. The connection between them was no longer a battleground. It was a sanctuary. "Lyra," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. The name was not a cry of grief. It was a farewell. He spoke it to the air, to the rafters, to the past. He looked back at Amara, his gaze impossibly soft. Her ghost, it's gone. He said it with a sense of wonder, of loss, and of a profound, earth-shattering freedom. You set me free." Amara felt tears well in her eyes, hot and sudden. She could only nod, her throat tight with an emotion so overwhelming it had no name. He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent conversation passing between them that was more profound than any words. It spoke of shared pain, of impossible choices, and of a new, fragile beginning forged in blood and moonlight. Then his eyes drifted shut, not in death, but in the deep, healing sleep of a body finally at peace. Over the next 2 days, the hold seemed to breathe again. Kaylin's recovery was the stuff of legends. By the next morning, he was sitting up, the wound on his side a newly healed scar, a testament to the combined power of his own strength and the bond he now shared with Amara. The shadow of grief that had clung to him for a decade had lifted, not vanishing entirely, but receding, like a winter fog burning off in the morning sun. The silence was gone. He spoke to his warriors, his voice holding its old authority but laced with a new warmth. He even, to the astonishment of the entire pack, shared a quiet laugh with Gregor, the old guard who had first met Amara at the gates. It was a rusty, unused sound, but it was real. Amara, however, became a recluse. She stayed in the infirmary, busying herself with the other wounded, her silence now a true retreat. She felt his presence constantly, a warm, steady hum at the back of her mind. She felt his gratitude, his wonder, his dawning affection, but she also felt a deep, gnawing uncertainty. She had healed the Alpha, she had saved him, but who was she now? She had shattered his old life, his identity. What did he truly want from the broken Omega, who had been the instrument of such a cataclysmic change? Was she just a key that had unlocked his cage, to be set aside now that he was free? He had been bound to a ghost for love. He was bound to her by fate. They were not the same thing. On the third evening, as a gentle snow once more began to fall, Alara came to the infirmary. The other wounded were sleeping. Maeve was dozing in her chair. "He is asking for you," Alara said, her voice soft. The beta's eyes, which had once held a cool professionalism, now held a deep, quiet respect. "He is in the great hall, alone." Amara's heart began to pound. This was it, the reckoning. She wiped her hands on her apron, her nerves a tangled knot. She followed Alara across the snow-dusted courtyard, the silence broken only by the crunch of their boots. The guards at the great hall doors nodded to them and swung the massive doors open. The hall was empty, save for one figure. Kaylin stood before the great hearth, where a massive fire roared, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The portrait of Lyra was gone. He turned as Amara entered, and the sight of him stole her breath. He was no longer the broken king or the tormented beast. He was just a man. A powerful, scarred, beautiful man, his eyes clear and focused solely on her. He dismissed Alara with a nod, and they were alone. The heavy doors closed, shutting out the world. For a long moment he simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. Amara's hands clenched at her sides. The silence stretched, but it was different now. It wasn't empty or oppressive. It was expectant. "Amara," he said, and her name on his lips was a melody. He took a step toward her. "For 10 years, this hall has been a tomb. I filled it with silence to honor a memory. I thought that was loyalty. I thought that was strength." He took another step, closing the distance between them. "But it was fear. I was afraid that if I let her go, there would be nothing left of me. I was afraid to live. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she had to tilt her head back to look up at him. You came here with nothing but your own courage. You have a silence that isn't born of fear, but of strength. You faced down my pack, my anger. You even faced down my wolf. You healed my people. You healed me. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her jaw, just as he had in the moonlit clearing. But this time there was no conflict, only a gentle, reverent awe. That night in the woods, you saved me from myself. And in the infirmary, you didn't just heal my body, you gave me back my soul. Her breath hitched, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. He brushed it away with his thumb. I have lived in a world without sound for a decade, but when you are near, I can hear everything. His gaze was intense, searching. I can hear the beat of your heart. I can hear the strength in your silence. It's the most beautiful sound I have ever known. He lowered his head, his forehead coming to rest against hers. He closed his eyes, simply breathing her in. My oath to Lyra was made in grief. It was an oath to die with her, but the vow you made when you kissed me, that was an oath of life. It was a promise to live. His voice dropped to a low, husky whisper that vibrated through her entire being. Let me honor it. Let me spend the rest of my life learning the sound of your soul. And then he kissed her. It was nothing like the desperate, frantic press of lips in the infirmary. This was a kiss of profound tenderness, of discovery, of promise. It was a kiss that spoke of gratitude and reverence. It was slow and deep, a silent conversation where his lips asked a question her heart had already answered. She melted against him, her hands coming up to rest on his broad chest, feeling the steady, powerful beat of his heart beneath her palm. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathless. He kept her framed between his hands, his luminous eyes shining with a light she had never seen before. It was not the cold light of winter or the wild light of the moon. It was the warm, steady light of a hearth fire, a light that promised shelter from the storm. He smiled, a true, breathtaking smile that transformed his harsh features, erasing the last shadows of his long grief. And in the warm, firelit silence of the great hall, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the promise of a future, Amara knew she was finally home. She raised a trembling hand, not to her throat, but to his heart. And for the first time in her life, she did not feel broken. She felt whole. 1 year later, the last of the snow was melting from the high peaks of the Blackwood Mountains, and the scent of damp earth and new life was a promise on the wind. Spring had come to the western clans, not just in the season, but in the soul of the pack. The long winter of their alpha's grief had finally, truly ended. Amara stood at the edge of the sacred clearing, the one that had once been a place of such torment. The sun, warm on her face, streamed through the new leaves of the ancient oak, dappling the ground in shifting patterns of light and shadow. The air was no longer heavy with sorrow. It was peaceful, filled with the buzz of bees and the distant call of a hawk. She was no longer the frightened fugitive Omega. She was the Luna of the Drausen clan, a title she wore not with arrogance, but with the quiet, steady grace of a river that has found its sea. Her silence, once her brand of shame, was now her strength. The pack had learned to read her expressions, to understand the language of her hands, to feel the calm certainty that radiated from her. They had come to understand that a voice was not required for wisdom, nor sound for leadership. She healed them, not just with her herbs, but with her presence. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and a familiar, beloved scent of pine and warm earth enveloped her. Kalen rested his chin on her shoulder, his big body a solid, comforting wall at her back. He wasn't the silent wolf anymore. He was simply her Kalen. I can feel your peace, he murmured, his voice a low, warm rumble against her ear. It feels like sunlight, she smiled, leaning her head back against his chest. The bond between them was no longer a tumultuous storm. It was a deep, tranquil ocean, a constant, silent conversation that flowed between their souls. She didn't need to speak to tell him she was happy. He felt it as surely as he felt the beat of his own heart. Together they walked to the center of the clearing, to the single, unmarked stone of white quartz, Lyra's grave. It was no longer a shrine to a ghost that held a man captive. It was a place of quiet memory, of respectful farewell. At its base, a small cluster of wild violets had pushed their way through the soil. Kalen knelt, just as he had that fateful night under the full moon. But this time, there was no agony on his face. He reached out and gently touched one of the new blossoms. Amara knelt beside him, placing her hand over his on the cool earth. He turned his hand, lacing his fingers with hers. He looked at the stone, then his gaze, full of a love so profound it made her heart ache, shifted to Amara. "Thank you," he said softly, speaking to the memory, to the past. "For the love you gave me. I will honor it always." He squeezed Amara's hand, his luminous gray-silver eyes holding hers. "And thank you," he whispered to her, "for teaching me how to live again." The ghosts were finally at peace. All of them. He stood, pulling her gently to her feet. He didn't turn away from the grave in haste. He simply stood with her, his mate, his Luna, acknowledging the journey that had brought them to this place of healing. After a long, peaceful moment, they turned and walked away, leaving the past to its quiet slumber. As they reached the edge of the woods, where they could see the Drausenhold sprawling in the valley below, smoke curling from chimneys, children chasing each other in the courtyard, a place of life and warmth, Kaelin stopped. He turned her to face him, his large hands framing her face with a tenderness that still made her breath catch. "My entire world was silent," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought it was empty, but I was wrong. I just didn't know the language." He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, deep kiss filled with the comfortable certainty of 1,000 shared sunrises. "You are my language, Amara. You are my sound, my soul, my silence." He pulled back, a breathtaking smile transforming his scarred face. His gaze was full of a light that was all his own, a light she had helped him find. Then his expression shifted, his eyes widening with a sudden, dawning wonder. His wolf, ever present, ever connected to her through the bond, had sensed something. Slowly, reverently, he lowered one hand from her face and laid it flat against her stomach. His palm was warm and broad, a shield of gentle strength. Through the bond, a new sensation flowed into her from him, a wave of pure, unadulterated joy, of fierce protectiveness, of utter, staggering awe. He knew. A tear of pure happiness slid down her cheek. She placed her own hand over his, giving a small affirmative nod. A new life, a new beginning, a promise of a future they had forged from the ashes of their broken pasts. Kaelin let out a sound, not a word but a low, guttural laugh of pure, unbridled joy that seemed to shake the very mountains. He swept her up into his arms, burying his face in her hair, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the universe. The alpha of the Western clans had once sworn his heart would never speak again. But his silent mate had taught him that the deepest promises are not spoken with words, but are felt in the marrow, in the blood, in the soul. And in the quiet peace of their shared world, their silent love was the loudest and most beautiful sound of all.